Picture this. You're an ancient human. You just cut your foot on a sharp rock while hunting. There's no hospital, no antibiotics, no urgent care clinic down the street, not even a bottle of hydrogen peroxide in some cave medicine cabinet somewhere. Just you, that wound, and a whole lot of bacteria that would genuinely love to ruin your entire week. And yet, here we are. Humans didn't just survive infections for hundreds of thousands of years before modern medicine showed up. We actually got surprisingly good at treating them. No microscopes, no germ theory, no pharmacies, just raw, accumulated human trial and error passed down generation after generation until our ancestors had built up a genuinely impressive toolkit for keeping infections from killing them. And honestly, some of what they figured out still works today. Hey, before we dive in, if you're into this kind of stuff, ancient survival, weird history, the genuinely clever things our ancestors figured out without any modern tech, do me a quick favor, hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel out, and you'll never miss a video. All right, let's get into it. Let's start with the most basic thing ancient humans figured out about infections. And honestly, it's almost embarrassingly simple. Wash the wound. That's it. That's the starting point. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence suggests ancient humans across pretty much every region on Earth independently figured out that cleaning a wound, usually with water, sometimes with salt water if they live near the coast, dramatically reduced the chance of that wound turning into something considerably worse. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't know why it worked, but they knew it worked. And that pattern of noticing what worked without understanding the science behind it, that's basically the entire story of ancient medicine right there. Now, let's bring up something genuinely fascinating. Honey. Yeah, honey. Ancient Egyptians, ancient Greeks, and various other cultures across the ancient world independently discovered that slapping honey directly onto a wound seemed to help it heal faster and get infected less often. And here's the wild part. They were completely right. Modern research has confirmed that honey has genuine antibacterial properties. It's low in moisture, slightly acidic, and produces small amounts of hydrogen peroxide naturally. Ancient healers had no idea about any of that chemistry. They just noticed the wounds treated with honey did better than the ones that weren't. So they kept doing it for thousands of years. Honey shows up in Egyptian medical papyri going back over 3,500 years as a wound treatment. That's not a coincidence. That's accumulated observation working exactly the way it's supposed to. Let's bring up something particularly clever now. Maggots. I know, stay with me here. It sounds absolutely disgusting. And honestly, it kind of is. But ancient healers in multiple cultures noticed something genuinely interesting. Wounds that got infested with certain fly larvae, specifically the ones that only eat dead tissue, actually healed better than wounds that got left alone to fester. The maggots would eat the dead, rotting flesh and leave the healthy tissue behind, basically doing a natural surgical cleanup. This wasn't universal, and it definitely wasn't pleasant, but maggot therapy is still used in modern medicine today for certain hard-to-treat wounds. Ancient humans figured this out just by watching what actually happened. Now, let's talk about plants, because this is where ancient medicine gets genuinely impressive. Pretty much every ancient culture developed detailed knowledge about which local plants had genuine medicinal properties, and a huge chunk of that knowledge was specifically about infections. Willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in modern aspirin, was used across multiple ancient cultures to reduce fever and pain during illness. Garlic, which has actual antibacterial and antifungal properties, was used everywhere from ancient Egypt to ancient China as a wound treatment and general infection fighter. Certain molds growing on bread were sometimes applied to infected wounds in ancient Egypt and China. And yes, some of those molds probably produced natural antibiotic compounds, thousands of years before Alexander Fleming officially discovered penicillin. Ancient humans weren't guessing randomly. They were running an enormous accumulated experiment across generations, keeping the treatments that worked and quietly dropping the ones that didn't. Let's bring up something really important though. Fire and heat. Ancient healers across numerous cultures figured out that cauterizing a wound, basically burning it closed with a hot piece of metal or a heated stone, could stop bleeding and, as it turns out, kill off a lot of the bacteria in the process. It was brutal. It was incredibly painful. There was no anesthetic. But it worked often enough that it stuck around as a medical practice for literally thousands of years. Boiling water to clean tools and cloth was also common in various ancient cultures, long before anyone understood why heat killed pathogens. They just knew clean tools worked better than dirty ones. Here's something worth appreciating. Ancient humans also understood isolation. Multiple ancient societies figured out that keeping sick people away from healthy people during certain outbreaks reduced how many folks got sick. The concept of quarantine actually goes back way further than most people realize. Ancient texts from various cultures reference separating the sick, avoiding contact with certain illnesses, and even destroying contaminated clothing or bedding. They didn't know about viruses or bacteria, but they absolutely knew that whatever was making people sick could somehow spread from one person to another, and that keeping distance helped. Now, let's bring up something particularly interesting: fermented foods and drinks. Ancient cultures around the world independently discovered fermentation, and a lot of what they fermented, things like beer, wine, fermented milk products, actually had mild antibacterial properties compared to plain water. In many ancient cities, drinking beer or wine was genuinely safer than drinking from the local water source, because the fermentation process killed off a lot of the dangerous stuff. Ancient people didn't know they were essentially pasteurizing their drinks, but they noticed the folks drinking fermented stuff got sick less often, so that practice stuck. Let's also talk about something genuinely underappreciated: bandaging and wound covering. Ancient cultures developed detailed knowledge about what to wrap a wound in, when to change it, and what materials worked best. Clean linen, certain leaves with natural antibacterial properties, spider webs, which, by the way, actually do have some clotting and mildly antibacterial effects, all showed up as wound coverings across various ancient cultures. Keeping a wound covered and protected from further contamination was one of the simplest, most effective infection prevention strategies ancient healers had. And they used it constantly. Okay, here's where I have to be honest with you though. Ancient medicine wasn't magic. A lot of people still died from infections that would be considered totally treatable today. Small cuts sometimes turned into fatal blood poisoning. Childbirth was genuinely dangerous. Any deep wound was a coin flip. For every ancient treatment that actually worked, there were plenty that were completely useless, or in some cases, actively harmful. Bloodletting comes to mind. Certain toxic herbs. Rituals that had zero medical effect. Ancient humans were doing the best they could with the information they had, and sometimes that information was just wrong. But here's what's genuinely worth appreciating. The stuff that did work: honey on wounds, willow bark for fever, garlic for infections, quarantine for outbreaks, boiling water for cleanliness. That stuff didn't come from any single genius inventor. It came from generations of ordinary people paying close attention to what actually helped and what actually didn't. Somebody's grandmother noticed something. She told her daughter told her daughter. And 1,000 years later, that same treatment was still being used because it still worked. So how did ancient humans actually treat infections? The honest answer is a combination of things. Basic wound cleaning with water and salt, natural antibacterial substances like honey, garlic, and certain molds, plant-based medicines targeting fever and inflammation, cauterization and heat for the really serious stuff, isolation and quarantine for contagious diseases, fermented foods and drinks that happen to be safer than contaminated water, and bandaging techniques that kept wounds protected while they healed. And maybe the most impressive thing about all of it, none of it was written down for most of human history. It was all passed on through direct teaching, mother to daughter, healer to apprentice, generation to generation. An entire medical tradition built entirely on careful observation and shared human knowledge, keeping our species alive for hundreds of thousands of years before modern medicine ever showed up. Not bad for people with no microscopes, no textbooks, and no idea what a germ actually was.